There have been some disturbing claims from veterans of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq regarding abuses by special forces. Now, I'm not suggesting this is completely new. These allegations have come out before, but what's troubling is it seems to go to quite a high level. Um, I'm going to read out a report from the Metro, but there's also a report in the BBC, and I'll link that one because I'm not reading it out for convenience of viewers. And that reports that General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, senior general in the British Army, blocked the process of Afghan special forces settling in the UK. Now, to be clear, these are people who risk their lives to work with the British Army. The reasoning for blocking that process for them settling in the UK, i.e., because they would have been threatened by the Taliban, is because of allegations made against the SAS and the SBS, that is the Special Boat Service of the Royal Navy. I'm going to read out this report, but before I do, I just want to respond to some of the sort of feedback or some of the attitudes I've seen online to this because it goes along the lines of shooting the messenger, i.e., attacking the BBC for being unpatriotic, um, or people coming out with this line of, those who weren't there can't criticize. Well, this is the thing. The people who are making the allegations were there. The people who are making the allegations are themselves veterans. So we're not talking about outsiders kind of judging from far away. This is people who actually were in the shoes of those who have faced the accusations. So I think they know what they're talking about. And what do they have to gain from it? You know, um, I think the idea that it's easy to make accusations in any military unit, frankly, anywhere in the world, is nonsense. They face a very real backlash for doing so, but I think they've followed their conscience and done what they think is right. Now, I should say these are allegations. That is not the same as, facts. And I think that anyone accused should have due process. But I honestly don't think it's inconceivable that some of our forces did indeed cross a line. And with this, I'm going to read out the report. Um, it's quite shocking stuff. One more thing I'll say before I get into this, because it's another important point. People say, oh, what about the Taliban? What about various militia groups? Well, a professional army shouldn't lower itself to the standards of a bunch of Islamist thugs. A professional army shouldn't lower itself to the standards of the Taliban. So I think it's a very weak argument to say, well, the Taliban do worse. Therefore, our forces should be allowed to get away with this stuff. Um, it's not the first time in recent years that the British Army's come under scrutiny. In Kenya, back in 2013, there was a rape murder, and that caused significant bad feelings locally. I think that it is very, very important that justice is seen to be done. That is to say, if there is evidence that a soldier, a sailor, or an airman abuses their position, they should be held to account. And I don't think it's unpatriotic to say so. The vast majority of military personnel are not abusing their position. And actually, I think they endanger those who, I think those who abuse their position are actually endangering their comrades because rather than winning hearts and minds, it's only going to breed local resentment, obviously. But I think anyone who claims this never happens in the British Armed Forces is being a fool. I think it's Fox patriotism. I think that, put it this way, if someone is abusing a civilian, they sure as hell don't act in my name. And I don't see that person as a hero. I see them as a thug abusing the position. There's never, ever an excuse for someone in uniform abusing a civilian. There just isn't. If someone is armed and they're defending themselves, that's a totally different situation. I'm not talking here about um, Taliban fighters or militants. I'm talking about real serious allegations of abuse towards civilians. And with that, I will read out the report. The report's by Josh Payne, and it's from May the 13th. British Special Forces soldiers handcuffed and shot civilians, including a young boy while serving in Afghanistan and Iraq, veterans claim, not outsiders, not lawyers, veterans. One SAS veteran said the killing of detainees became routine, and soldiers would allegedly search someone, handcuff them, then shoot them before cutting off plastic handcuffs and planting a pistol by the bodies. One told the BBC's Panorama about an alleged victim who was clearly a child not even close to fighting age. The claims of war crimes come during a public inquiry into extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2013. But the new allegations span more than a decade, longer than three-year period under investigation by the UK judge-led inquiry. For the first time, members of the Special Boat Service (SBS), the Royal Navy's elite Special Forces unit, have been implicated. One SBS veteran said troops were barbaric, that's a direct quote, and acted with a mob mentality. He said, I saw the quietest guys switch, show serious psychopathic traits. They were lawless. They felt untouchable. One Special Forces veteran said, on some operations, the troop will go into guest house type buildings to kill everyone there. He said they go in and shoot everyone sleeping there on entry. It's not justified killing people in their sleep. Afterwards, it alleged officers had helped falsify reports. The BBC said multiple people who attended meetings between Lord Cameron and then Afghan President Hamid Karzai had spoken about Mr. Karzai consistently, repeatedly mentioned this issue. A spokesman for Lord Cameron said any suggestion that he colluded in covering up allegations of serious criminal wrongdoing is total nonsense. The Ministry of Defence said it was fully committed to supporting the ongoing inquiry and urged anyone with relevant information to come forward, adding it was not appropriate from the MOD to comment on allegations explored by the inquiry. Panorama Special Forces ISO War Crimes is available on iPlayer. I would also add to that, I would say that any general or senior officer whose knee-jerk reaction to this is just to outright deny it, I would be suspicious of that. I mean, when you consider that thousands of personnel were involved in Afghanistan, most of them, yes, under very trying circumstances, the idea that absolutely none of them abused their position, I think it's nonsense. This idea, that they went in and acted with impunity, I think it's plausible. Now, I don't know, I wasn't there. But like I say, the whistleblowers, the veterans who were, I think they know what they're talking about. And what would they get to gain from it? They would face the backlash of those who they're making accusations against. Um, it kind of reminds me this desensitization. It's a bit like what Israel's doing in Gaza, and I'll be making a video on that. But I really get frankly angry with this mentality that it's somehow unpatriotic or anti-military to condemn individuals abusing their position. It's not demonizing all soldiers. It's not smearing all soldiers by saying that there are some rotten apples. And I think those individuals should go to jail. There's absolutely no excuse for anyone in uniform to abuse or even worse, murder a civilian. There just isn't. Um, People will say there's battlefield stress or situations civilians can never comprehend. That is true. But again, I keep emphasizing this point that the whistleblowers are themselves veterans. They have been in their shoes. They know what the battlefield situation is like. They know the stress that they're under. And they obviously see it as wrong. I think they're worth listening to. So I hope the army cooperates fully. The Ministry of Defence is, that's political. I hope the army cooperates fully. And I hope they don't protect anyone who is involved in this. I've also heard people say, oh, don't prosecute soldiers, prosecute the politicians who sent them there. If there's any evidence of government collusion, then that is a very, very serious matter. But I don't really accept that because a prime minister makes a controversial decision, right or wrong, to be involved in a particular military campaign, that somehow equates to giving a green light to soldiers to abuse civilians. Now, the war on terror remains very controversial. I happen to think Afghanistan is different from Iraq, but I don't accept that because Tony Blair decided to go into that, controversially so, that somehow means that Blair gave a green light for soldiers to commit war crimes. I don't think it's the same thing, actually. I actually take the view that soldiers are responsible for their own actions. Senior officers um, who oversee this and do nothing about it are responsible for that. I don't really believe that Tony Blair, David Cameron gave orders from Downing Street, you need to break into homes and abuse civilians. That doesn't mean, by the way, that government shouldn't face criticism. I'm not saying that for a second, but I don't accept this argument that soldiers aren't responsible for their own actions. I think they are. Um, and there are other areas. I mean, if we look at Northern Ireland, we know that personnel who've served there are now facing historic abuse claims. The only thing with that, I would say, is it has to be evenly applied. I do think it's fundamentally unfair. The IRA terrorists served only a couple of years and they get immunity um, due to the peace settlements that were reached with the Good Friday Agreement. But now there's historic investigations opening up into what British soldiers may or may not have done. It does seem unfair. So if there's going to be inquiries into what soldiers may or may not have done, and there should also be inquiries into what paramilitary's done, including the IRA. It should never ever be forgotten that the IRA was a brutal terrorist organization that deliberately murdered civilians. So I believe in justice. Everything I've said. I don't think there's ever an excuse for a soldier to abuse his or her position, but in the case of Northern Ireland, I think at least it should be evenly applied. And I do think there's a perception that, lawyers are now going after soldiers in the 70s and 80s. It doesn't mean they're innocent, but what about IRA gunmen who done terrible things? That's that's the caveat I would say with Northern Ireland, that it doesn't seem to be evenly applied. It seems to be only focused on British soldiers and not terrorists on both the nationalist and union sides who've done some horrendous things. Um, but regarding Afghanistan, the army shouldn't put up any barriers. There should be no cover-ups. The army needs to show that it takes this seriously. I mean, it's just common sense. It's bad for hearts and minds if British soldiers are behaving this way towards civilians. It certainly won't endear them to locals. That just goes without saying. And a final point, anyone who thinks I'm being disrespectful to the military or I'm smearing soldiers, not at all. I think actually, even with this, the British Army is one of the most professional in the world. Soldiers do face really real risks. There are brave men and women who absolutely we should be proud of. Um, uh, and the fact that abuses if occurred doesn't mean that all soldiers will be smeared with the same brush. But it's a little bit like corruption and abuses within the Metropolitan Police or other police forces. If good soldiers don't speak up, or if they pretend that there isn't a problem, then they can't complain when there is a bad perception. You know, I responded to someone who was talking about who are these alleged whistleblowers? Why won't they show their faces? Precisely for the reason that they'll get a backlash. And I semi sarcastically said to this person, I suppose you'd favour hazing in the army. Um, these are very serious allegations. They have to be taken seriously. And the army cannot just outright deny it. They have to take it seriously and they have to show that they're willing to work with the inquiry and not protect those who may have been involved in these abuses. I personally think if there is strong evidence suggesting any SAS personnel has killed or abused civilians, they should go to jail. I don't think there should be any special immunity because it was stressful or something. No, there is no excuse for doing that. That's how I feel about it. Let me know your thoughts.